When a narcissist encounters an empath who finally understands their own worth, the entire dynamic they rely on begins to crumble because the narcissist's power depends almost entirely on the other person believing they are less than what they truly are. A narcissist thrives on the subtle erosion of confidence, on convincing someone that their needs are excessive, their emotions are inconvenient, and their intuition is unreliable. They create a psychological environment where the empath constantly doubts themselves, always questioning whether they are too sensitive or too demanding. But the moment the empath begins to awaken to the truth that their sensitivity is not a flaw but a gift, that their intuition has been accurate all along, and that their capacity to love deeply is a strength rather than a vulnerability, the narcissist's hold begins to weaken. Awareness is the first crack in the narcissist's face, aid of control. Once the empath realizes that they have been manipulated, that their compassion has been used against them, and that their good nature has been exploited to maintain the narcissist's inflated ego, the dynamic shifts in a way the narcissist cannot handle. Narcissists depend on emotional compliance. They need the empath to absorb the blame, carry the guilt, and accept the narrative that the narcissist carefully constructs. When the empath refuses to accept this role and begins asserting their boundaries, the narcissist experiences it as a threat because their control is slipping. The empath's self-worth becomes a mirror that exposes the narcissist's true nature, a fragile sense of superiority built on insecurity and emptiness. And that mirror is something the narcissist cannot bear to face. As the empath grows stronger, they stop seeking the narcissist's approval. And this is catastrophic to the narcissist because approval, admiration, and emotional reactions are the very fuel they rely on. The empath begins to detach emotionally, no longer reacting to provocations, guilt trips, or manipulative tactics. This detachment, driven by newly found self-respect, is what terrifies the narcissist most. They begin to realize they cannot penetrate the empath's mind the way they once did, cannot twist their emotions, cannot bend their boundaries. The empath's worth becomes an impenetrable shield. Instead of trying harder to please the narcissist, the empath starts questioning why they ever felt the need to in the first place. This internal shift is powerful because it reclaims the emotional space the narcissist once controlled. The empath starts seeing patterns clearly, the gaslighting, the blame shifting, the emotional highs and lows designed to create dependency. They learn to separate their identity from the narcissist's approval. They begin to value their own peace more than the narcissist's validation. And with every step towards self-worth, the narcissist loses the psychological dominance they depended on. The narcissist becomes increasingly anxious, reactive, and desperate because nothing threatens them more than someone they once controlled suddenly becoming immune to manipulation. For the first time, the empath sees their own value clearly, not as something to be negotiated or diminished, but as a truth that does not require external confirmation. And in that realization lies the ultimate threat to the narcissist and empath who refuses to be broken, who refuses to be defined by someone else's insecurity, and who finally understands that their worth was never dependent on the narcissist's validation in the first place. Clarity and emotional awareness in an empath are like switching on a light in a room a narcissist has kept deliberately dark because their manipulation depends heavily on confusion, self-doubt, and emotional fog. A narcissist thrives when the empath questions their own perception, when they mistake manipulation for love, and when they interpret chaos as passion or intensity. But the moment the empath begins to understand their emotional landscape, what they feel, why they feel it, and where those feelings originate, the narcissist's power begins to dissolve. Emotional awareness is dangerous to a narcissist because it interrupts the psychological games they rely on. Gaslighting no longer works when the empath recognizes the difference between their authentic emotions and the emotional distortions imposed on them. Suddenly, the empath notices subtle shifts they once overlooked, the narcissist's strategic silence, their selective affection, their calculated criticism, and the way they weaponize vulnerability. With clarity, these patterns no longer look like misunderstandings or emotional accidents. They look like intentional methods of control. Clarity cuts through charm, excuses, and illusions. When the empath starts observing instead of absorbing, the narcissist loses the ability to shape the empath's reality. Emotional awareness also means the empath begins to understand their triggers, their wounds, and their tendency to overgive. They start recognizing how their compassion made them susceptible to manipulation. They stop assuming responsibility for emotions that aren't theirs, and they no longer automatically soothe, explain, or justify everything to maintain harmony. This shift is profoundly threatening to the narcissist because they need the empath to remain emotionally unaware in order to keep the dynamic unbalanced. Narcissists depend on reactions. They thrive on emotional responses, whether positive or negative. But clarity brings emotional neutrality, and emotional neutrality is something a narcissist cannot manipulate. When the empath stops reacting in predictable ways, the narcissist's strategies fail. Anger no longer provokes guilt. Silent treatment no longer creates anxiety. Love bombing no longer captures the empath's heart with the same intensity. The empath's emotional awareness creates distance, and that distance reveals even more truths. They begin to see the narcissist's fear of being ordinary, their hunger for validation, their inability to tolerate criticism, and their desperate need to appear superior. Instead of seeing a powerful, charismatic figure, the empath starts seeing a fragile ego wrapped in entitlement. This shift in perception is devastating to the narcissist because their entire identity depends on maintaining the illusion of superiority. The empath's clarity disrupts this illusion. It becomes a mirror the narcissist cannot hide from. Emotional awareness also empowers the empath to identify manipulation in real time. They notice the timing, the tone, the inconsistencies. They see how the narcissist distorts narratives to avoid accountability. They recognize when affection is conditional and when praise is just bait. This awareness leads to healthier boundaries, and those boundaries are almost impossible for a narcissist to breach. The empath no longer internalizes the narcissist's projections. They stop believing that they are too sensitive, too emotional, or never enough. They begin to trust their intuition, which has been trying to warn them all along. This new level of self-trust breaks the psychological dependency that once tied them to the narcissist. Once the empath knows the truth, they cannot unsee it, and the narcissist cannot tolerate someone who sees them clearly because clarity strips away power and emotional awareness dismantles control. The empath becomes someone the narcissist can no longer manipulate, no longer confuse, and no longer dominate, which makes that clarity the very thing a narcissist fears the most. Boundaries set by an empowered empath dismantle a narcissist's ability to manipulate because boundaries are the one thing a narcissist cannot penetrate, negotiate, or override unless the other person allows it. Narcissists control through access. Access to your emotions, your attention, your time, your empathy, and your willingness to bend your needs for theirs. They rely on the empath's natural instinct to nurture, to understand, to fix, and to forgive. But the moment the empath begins drawing clear lines around what is acceptable and what is not, the narcissist finds themselves confronting a kind of resistance they are completely unprepared for. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters, and when an empath finally understands this, they begin filtering out manipulation, chaos, and emotional demands that drain them. This shift is deeply threatening to a narcissist because it limits the emotional supply they depend on. The empath begins saying no to things they once tolerated, and this no carries weight. It is backed by self-respect rather than fear of conflict. The narcissist senses the change immediately because boundary setting disrupts the entire rhythm of the relationship. Manipulative tactics that once worked flawlessly begin to fall flat. The guilt trips no longer land, the emotional outbursts no longer intimidate, and the silent treatments no longer create panic. Instead, the empath responds with calm detachment, refusing to chase or collapse under pressure. This emotional self-control is something a narcissist cannot manipulate because it removes their ability to create psychological instability. Boundaries also expose the narcissist entitlement. They believe they are exempt from the limitations and rules that apply to others. So when an empath enforces a boundary, whether it's refusing to engage in circular arguments, declining unreasonable demands, or simply stepping away from toxic behavior, the narcissist experiences it as an attack on their authority. They push back harder at first, testing every line, trying to reclaim the control they are losing. But the empowered empath holds firm, and this consistency is a kind of strength the narcissist is not used to facing. Over time, boundaries begin to reveal who the narcissist truly is. Without the ability to dominate, they become irritable, defensive, critical, or suddenly distant. Their charm fades, their mask slips. The empath sees how conditional the narcissist affection has always been. They notice how quickly the narcissist withdraws warmth when their demands are not met. The empath finally understands that the love they thought they were receiving was just a reward for compliance, not genuine care. This realization strengthens the empath's resolve even more. They stop personalizing the narcissist's reactions and start recognizing them as predictable responses to losing control. The narcissist becomes exposed not as a powerful figure, but as someone who relies on others having no boundaries in order to feel significant. Boundaries also give the empath room to reconnect with themselves. They reclaim their energy, their time, and their mental clarity. They rediscover their own voice, which was overshadowed for so long by the narcissist's overwhelming demands. As the empath grows stronger, more confident, and more grounded, the narcissist loses their primary leverage, the ability to destabilize the empath emotionally. What once triggered confusion now triggers awareness. What once created fear now creates distance. What once kept the empath trapped now motivates them to break free. In the end, boundaries become the empowered empath's most powerful weapon, not because they are aggressive or punitive, but because they restore balance, self-respect, and emotional autonomy, three things a narcissist cannot tolerate and cannot control. When an empath stops over-giving, the narcissist loses their primary source of supply because their entire dynamic depends on the empath pouring out emotional energy without limits. Narcissists thrive on the imbalance created by one person giving endlessly while they take without reciprocity. The empath often enters the relationship believing that love, understanding, and compassion can heal or stabilize the narcissist, and this belief becomes the trap that keeps them emotionally invested. But when the empath finally recognizes that their giving is not being valued, reciprocated, or even acknowledged, something shifts internally. They begin withdrawing the limitless emotional support that once fed the narcissist's ego. And that withdrawal becomes one of the most threatening things a narcissist can experience. For the narcissist, the empath's giving is not seen as kindness. It is seen as entitlement, as something they believe they deserve without effort. They have become accustomed to the empath's patience, their forgiveness, their sacrifice, and their willingness to put the narcissist's needs above their own. When the empath stops doing this, it disrupts the narcissist's sense of superiority and control. Suddenly, the narcissist is no longer the center of attention. They are no longer being validated, reassured, or emotionally catered to. The flow of admiration dries up, and with it, the narcissist's emotional stability begins to crack. Narcissists depend heavily on emotional reactions, both positive and negative. They feed off affection, praise anxiety, confusion, and even conflict because all of it keeps the empath emotionally entangled with them. But when the empath stops giving, stops over-explaining, over-apologizing, over-accommodating, over-empathizing, the narcissist feels abandoned, exposed, and powerless. The silence from the empath is louder than any argument they could initiate. The absence of emotional supply forces the narcissist to confront a reality they are not equipped to handle. They cannot function without someone constantly feeding their sense of importance. Once the empath stops giving, they begin to recognize how much of themselves they lost in the process. They see how drained they became, how their needs were ignored, how their boundaries were erased. This self-realization fuels an inner strength that makes the narcissist even more uncomfortable. The empath becomes more aware of the manipulation they endured, more conscious of the imbalance they tolerated, and more committed to reclaiming their peace. Meanwhile, the narcissist becomes increasingly frantic. They may try love, bombing again, making grand promises or sudden gestures of affection, but the empath no longer responds with the same emotional vulnerability. They may try rage, guilt-tripping, or victim, playing to reignite the giving cycle, but the empath's detachment makes these tactics less effective. And with each failed attempt, the narcissist becomes more panicked because their sense of control is slipping away completely. Over-giving once allowed the narcissist to define the relationship, dictate the emotional climate, and maintain the upper hand. But when the empath stops over-giving, the balance of power shifts dramatically. The narcissist can no longer regulate their self-esteem through the empath. They can no longer outsource responsibility for their emotional needs. They can no longer rely on the empath to fix their crisis or absorb their emotional chaos. The empath's decision to stop giving does not come from spite, but from survival. They finally understand that love is not supposed to drain them, break them, or make them feel invisible. They realize that real connection requires mutual effort, and that their compassion should not be used as a weapon against them. As the empath begins giving to themselves instead of giving endlessly to the narcissist, they rediscover their identity, their strength, and their emotional independence. And in that transformation lies the narcissist's greatest loss, because nothing destroys a parasitic dynamic faster than the moment the host refuses to keep feeding it. Emotional detachment from the empath exposes the narcissist's insecurity and fragility, because narcissists rely entirely on emotional control to maintain their sense of superiority. As long as the empath remains emotionally entangled, reacting to their moods, explaining themselves, defending themselves, seeking approval, or trying to repair the relationship, the narcissist feels powerful and relevant. They read every emotional response as proof that they still matter, that they still have influence, that they still occupy space inside the empath's mind. But the moment the empath begins to detach, the narcissist senses that their emotional leverage is disappearing, and this triggers a level of panic they can no longer hide. Emotional detachment is not anger avoidance or passive resistance. It is the quiet realization that the narcissist no longer has the ability to affect the empath the way they once did. It is the shift from reacting to observing, from absorbing to analyzing, from seeking connection to understanding distance. This shift makes the narcissist's usual tactics ineffective. Rage no longer pulls the empath into conflict. Silent treatment no longer creates fear or pressure. Jealousy games no longer spark insecurity. Even love bombing begins to feel hollow and predictable. The narcissist loses the emotional buttons they once pressed so easily, and suddenly they are forced to confront the reality that their power was an illusion built on the empath's emotional investment. Once that investment fades, the narcissist has nothing to stand on. Detachment exposes the narcissist because it reveals how dependent they were on the empath's reactions. Beneath their confidence lies a deep fear of being insignificant, unadmired, or unneeded. They need validation to feel alive, and they depend on emotional chaos to feel in control. But when the empath detaches, the narcissist is left alone with the very feelings they have spent their entire life avoiding: emptiness, inadequacy, and irrelevance. The empath's calm becomes unbearable for the narcissist. They may accuse the empath of being cold, selfish, or ungrateful, not because the empath has done anything wrong, but because the narcissist cannot comprehend a world where they are not the center of someone's emotional universe. This is why detachment is more threatening than confrontation. Confrontation still shows emotional involvement, but detachment shows freedom. When the empath no longer needs explanations, closure, or validation, they reclaim their power. They see the narcissist's behavior clearly instead of through the lens of emotional distortion. They understand the manipulation, the cycles, and the tactics without internalizing the blame. This clarity removes the fuel the narcissist feeds on. The narcissist becomes increasingly unstable because they cannot tolerate losing control. They may escalate their behavior, becoming more dramatic, more critical, more affectionate, or more desperate in an attempt to pull the empath back into emotional dependence. But detachment creates a psychological barrier that the narcissist cannot cross. The empath has seen too much, understood too much, and grown too much to fall back into the old patterns. The narcissist's insecurity becomes fully visible during this stage. Without emotional dominance, their mask cracks, the exaggerated confidence fades, the false superiority collapses. They begin seeking new sources of validation because the empath is no longer giving them the emotional nourishment they require. And as the empath continues detaching, the narcissist slowly realizes that the dynamic they once controlled is no longer in their hands. What terrifies them most is not the loss of the relationship, but the loss of significance. The empath's emotional detachment marks the beginning of true liberation. It signifies the moment when the narcissist's influence dissolves and the empath's self-worth rises above manipulation. And in that quiet separation, the narcissist's deepest insecurities are exposed, not through conflict, but through the empath's peaceful refusal to be controlled any longer.